We've got some huge updates for Donkey Kong Bonanza on the Nintendo Switch 2 as Nintendo has released a brand new Ask the Developer segment on the game, and it goes over some incredibly interesting information when it comes to the version of the game that was on the Nintendo Switch 1 compared to when they decided to move it to the Nintendo Switch 2, in addition to other very crazy aspects about the development of the voxel technology and all of that. The full Ask the Developer interview will be linked in the description below, but I wanted to go over some of the most interesting aspects of this game and how the Nintendo Switch 2 actually made that possible. It also confirms another theory that I had before Nintendo even talked about it right here, is that Nintendo actually created a concept of gameplay for this first, and then they attached a character to it because they were experimenting with the voxel smashing technology from Super Mario Odyssey, and Donkey Kong was then attached to that. So let's get into some certain interesting parts of this interview, and of course other huge Nintendo Switch 2 information as well later. So here is part of the interview where the person asking the question says this: speaking of what's changed since Super Mario Odyssey, Donkey Kong Bonanza is being released as a Nintendo Switch 2 game. Given the development timeline, was it planned as a Switch 2 game from the beginning? Here's what Motokura had to say. We originally began developing Donkey Kong Bonanza on the Nintendo Switch, but we ran into some challenges. I think it was around 2021 when we started to think about moving development to Switch 2. Here's what Wanatabe had to say. We looked into how we could upgrade what we'd originally built for the Switch to take advantage of Switch 2. One of the most obvious improvements was that we could place far more objects in the environment than before. Being able to place more objects in the terrain didn't just enhance the game's visual richness, more importantly, it increased the amount of things players could destroy, which amplified the exhilaration of being able to demolish anything and everything. That went hand in hand with the game's core concept of destruction. It convinced us that this game would be even more fun if we developed it for Switch 2. They also showed off a graphical assessment between the Switch 1 version that they had running and the Nintendo Switch 2 version. And this to me is very interesting because it shows that the Nintendo Switch 2 obviously can push out way more graphical detail and everything, but it even gets crazier when it comes to the voxel technology that they could push on the Nintendo Switch 2. So here's what Tanaka had to say on this. From a programmer's perspective, voxel technology is well suited for creating gameplay centered around destruction. However, it also uses a lot of system memory, and we face the challenge of Switch not having enough to support everything we wanted to do. I'll explain with some simple arithmetic. If you're asked to double the size of a 1x1 pixel image in both width and height, you end up with a 2x2 image, which means 4 times as many pixels. But when you do the same with voxels, you've got width and height, but also depth to contend with. So doubling all 3 dimensions gives you 2x2x2, or 8 times the data. It may sound simple to just double something, but the reality is that memory usage, voxel density, and all kinds of processes end up gobbling up 8 times the resources. It was clear that the memory available on the Switch would struggle to handle that load, and we felt that manifesting the huge volume of terrain that we did might have been unachievable on that platform. With the move to Switch 2, we gained not only more memory, but also greater processing capacity. That gave us the freedom to incorporate gameplay ideas we'd previously abandoned because they were too demanding. When we got down to trying it, we discovered that not only could it handle the heavy processing requirements, but it also ran at 60 frames per second. Things we'd given up on, like explosions, flinging large objects, or causing them to collapse, were now possible. Designers could also place as many objects as they wanted. There were so many moments when we thought to ourselves, now we can really do this. Wanatabe also chimes in by saying, as well as running at a smooth 60 FPS, the core gameplay of smashing got way more satisfying. The physics of smashing involve lots of things all happening at once. Donkey Kong throws a punch, the terrain and objects break apart, the visual effects show debris flying outward. All of that is packed into a single moment. At 30 FPS, we couldn't fully capture everything that happens in that instant, but at 60 FPS, we saw the sense of destruction coming through much more clearly. We thought to ourselves, now we've got something seriously satisfying. not only did Switch 2 enable the game to run well, it unlocked the game's full potential. No, it made the game possible. But before we continue with this awesome Donkey Kong Bonanza news, please make sure you subscribe if you're not, because we are giving away 3 digital copies of Donkey Kong Bonanza. All of the details are in the link in the description below, so hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and let me know what you're looking forward to most in Donkey Kong Bonanza. This is what I wanted to talk about when people were trying to say, oh, it's a Switch 1 game, it's not necessarily a Switch 2 game, and I said, no, the game that you're seeing, in terms of everything that they showed, how impressive it looks, the voxel technology, the destruction, the frame rate, how it even came to be with the details and everything was made possible because of the Nintendo Switch 2. Sure, you can take games that run on stronger hardware and downport them to the Nintendo Switch 1. Heck, you might even be able to downport them to the Xbox 360 or PS3 from stronger systems. But sometimes when you're creating a game, a certain type of game, especially a game that has this voxel technology where you're going to need a lot of memory usage, there is a ton of explosions and details and breaking apart. This is what actually comprises and make the game what it is, and is going to make Donkey Kong Bonanza as good as it is. It's not going to be anywhere near as good if they had a Switch 1 version running at 30 FPS, nowhere near the destruction or explosions. It no longer becomes what Donkey Kong Bonanza is supposed to be. And according to the developers themselves, it made the game possible in terms of their vision and what they wanted to do. So I really don't want to hear any more nonsense from people saying that it's just a Switch 1 game and it could have been on there. Yeah, sure, it could have been on there. That's nothing like the game that we're getting. That's probably going to be a Game of the Year candidate or a Game of the Year nominee for many different categories, or if it was running at 30 FPS with some dips, without all the explosions, without all of the voxel density, with all the issues that they're kind of bringing up, which we saw on the Nintendo Switch 1, even from Nintendo's first party games, at times, it no longer becomes the Donkey Kong Bonanza game that we're getting right now. So the Nintendo Switch 2 made this game the way that it is. So I think that kind of ends that right there overall. Now there's more information that they talked about on the full interview, so you guys can check that out. And I also might make some other topics or discussion pieces on what they have to say, but I felt that was the most interesting thing out of the whole interview overall. But you guys can check out the full thing. But let's go ahead and jump into this next topic here. I'm going to be discussing what Nate the Hate has heard about some third-party developers when it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2 games. So here's what he had to say in his most recent Nate the Hate podcast, where he did confirm that there will be a Nintendo Direct after Donkey Kong Bonanza releases, but he also had this to say: Capcom, Sega, Ubisoft, Namco, and many others are just waiting. They have games they want to announce. They have a lot of support coming to Switch 2. So this was something that people were talking about when it comes to the Summer Games Fest, or when it comes to some of the other presentations, and developers have not been announcing Nintendo Switch 2 games, and people are saying, oh, it's just going to be like Switch 1, or oh, it's going to be like Wii U, or some other nonsense that people are already rushing to conclusion when it comes to the system that's barely been out for less than 2 months. But this is what I've said before, is that third-party developers are going to have a bunch of games, especially Japanese developers. On here, they talk about Sega, Capcom, Namco, and there's even going to be more when it comes down to it. And the reason why they're waiting is because they want to maximize the sales potential. They want to maximize the impact of the game's announcement. And there's a bunch of games that released on the Nintendo Switch 1 that developers want those games to kind of clear first, and then get closer to the release, they can talk about the Nintendo Switch 2 version in a Nintendo Direct. One of the best ways to sell your games is to have it in a Nintendo Direct. That has just been one of the things that works. And yes, sure, you can have it announced at other places, but the impact of having something announced at a Nintendo Direct for the first time and people seeing it on there, it is huge. And that's why this Nintendo Direct is coming up here, where there's going to be a number of third-party announcements. But we had a bunch of third-party announcements already with the first wave of Nintendo Switch news with the launch of the system, and also talked about some other games like Borderlands and stuff that's coming out later, Final Fantasy VII Remake. So there's going to be a lot more announcements. There's going to be a Nintendo Direct coming up here in July. There's going to be another Nintendo Direct in the fall, probably around September or so, and there's going to be third-party announcements at both of those. Maximum impact when it comes to announcing something is definitely at a Nintendo Direct. You can hype it up with pre-orders, launch dates, and it's just something that Nintendo's built into this juggernaut that is a proven way to sell first and third-party games overall. So that's kind of what's happening right now. I've heard of a ton of games as well. I've spoke with many different people overall, and you can just tell based off of the sales and the excitement that third-party developers are definitely chomping at the bit to get some of these bigger games announced. But of course, you want to wait for that maximum impact. You obviously want to wait for some of the games to clear, kind of some time for people to go by, pick up Mario Kart, Donkey Kong, the games that are coming out. Obviously, Cyberpunk is doing well, Fantasy Life, other titles, Street Fighter 6, all of that good stuff. And then the next wave of games will be announced now that we're about a month and a half, going on 2 months into the Switch 2 next month early. So it's coming, guys. There's going to be more games announced, and it's going to be extremely hyped. Now, am I saying that every single game that comes to Xbox and PlayStation and PC is coming to the Nintendo Switch 2? No, that's not what I'm saying. But are there going to be a lot of Japanese third-party support from what Nate had to say here and other developers? Absolutely. There's already been some here and there from the smaller developers, like let's say Falcom, for example, with Ease, 10 Proud Nordics, and some other games. Fantasy Life obviously been doing great, and there's been some other announcements here and there, but there's definitely going to be a lot more with the Nintendo Directs coming up, and of course other events as the Switch 2 really establishes itself past the launch of the system. So what do you guys think about more third-party games coming through? Let me know in the comment section. But now we're going to move on to another topic here, and that's going to be discussing Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D Remake. We've got an important update on this game, and it's not going to have an upgrade path or cross-save on the Nintendo Switch 1 to Nintendo Switch 2, which is very unfortunate because the Nintendo Switch 1 version of the game is a cartridge. It's fully on there, whereas the Nintendo Switch 2 version of the game is just a key card. So if you're someone who does not like key cards and you would have liked to be able to get the Nintendo Switch 1 version and then upgrade it from there to the Nintendo Switch 2 version, you're not going to be able to do that, which is just, once again, not necessarily great for consumers out there. We've seen other developers come out with some upgrade paths. We've seen it with Fantasy Life, for example. They have an upgrade path, and there's been other games that have an upgrade path. But Sega, Square Enix, they've been very hesitant, at least right now, on the upgrades overall. Sonic didn't have one. Now we have this here with Square Enix. So that's definitely not good at all, and I'm hoping that Square Enix reverses course when it comes to it, especially if they're going to be supporting Switch 1 and Switch 2. You might as well make an upgrade path for people to have. And of course, not having cross-save either, that also sucks, although it's not as bad with this one if you're talking about the Nintendo Switch 2, because the Switch 2 is a hybrid, so you can play it in that 60 FPS where it's probably going to be 30 FPS on Switch 1. You're going to be able to play it at 60 FPS on Switch 2 on your TV and on the go, whereas before the Nintendo Switch 2 came out, like let's just say with Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D Remake, you'd have to play that at 30 FPS on the TV and on the go. So maybe you would have wanted a PlayStation 5 version of the game or a PC version and then have cross save so you can play the Switch version portably only, but it's not as big of a deal here with that, but it's still an issue overall. So I'm hoping that Square Enix can get their cross-platform, cross-save stuff working better or just at all. I don't think they really have any of that. And then, of course, if they are going to continue making Switch 1 games, I would like to see some upgrade paths to the Nintendo Switch 2. So what do you guys think overall when it comes to Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D Remake and not having an upgrade path? Let me know in the comment section. But now we're going to move on to another topic here, and we've got a Nintendo Switch 2 update. Version 20.2.0 is out, and you guessed it, yes, it is true. Stability is out, but we got a couple other fixes and some things as well. So here's what they had to say on the website. Fixed an issue where parental control settings were not transferred to Nintendo Switch 2 from Nintendo Switch in certain circumstances during a system transfer. Fixed an issue where you could not proceed past searching for networks in internet settings within system settings. That's actually a pretty good one. And then also general system stability improvements to enhance the user's experience. That is the certified Hood Classic, the banger, the tried and true, the old faithful of Nintendo systems, the stability. And you bet that that probably has some hidden things kind of put in there when it comes to detecting piracy maybe, or some of the stuff with used games. There's been some issues there where some people were getting banned or some stuff like that when it comes down to it, because some people are taking the whole MIG switch situation and dumping the cartridges. So I think Nintendo needs to figure out something there with used games overall, although that might just be like a very small or certain scenario. I definitely think Nintendo is going to be vigilant against stuff like that when it comes to their system stability and updates just because of how crazy the piracy was on the Nintendo Switch 1. So what do you guys think about all the different updates here, and when do you think Nintendo's going to actually release a big update that adds some new features and stuff? Let me know in the comment section below. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video here. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, and check out my other Nintendo Switch 2 RPG content and more right here on screen. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys for the next one. Peace.